Today we'll be talking about conditionals in Python. So I think conditionals is one of the most important topics in basic Python because it's used everywhere, and um and they're quite simple because they're more intuitive than some of the other things in programming, since it's kind of like in speech already, right? If this happens, then we'll allow this to happen. So the first kind of conditional is the if statement, or the main type of conditional. And it's pretty self-explanatory. It's just if something happens, if a condition is met, then something happens, right? So let's take an example. So I'm gonna preset happiness to 125. So that's just an arbitrary value assigned to happiness, which is a variable. So now our condition is if happiness is greater than 100, then we want to do something, print happy. So right now, what we're doing is we actually wrote a conditional. So the way you write an if statement is use the if keyword and then the condition after that, which is like anything that can be true or false, and then um, the colon, in order to indicate everything after it, is executed if the condition is met, and then the indentation to um, indicate what actions you want to take if the condition is met. So if the condition is not met, then nothing will happen. But if the condition is met, then you'll print happy from this statement. So right now we can see that happy is in fact greater than 125 since we preset it as 120. I mean, it's greater than 100 since we preset it as 125. So we should expect this to return happy. So we should expect it to print happy. See, when we ran it, it printed happy. However, what happens if the condition is not met? As I said earlier, it will not run. So if I have 90, then nothing will happen, right? You see that? So yeah, that's like the main basic concept behind if statements. You can also like use if statements in loops. So you apply the if statement every time you loop through the loop. I'm not going to show that because I think that's pretty self-explanatory. But yeah, let's move on to the next topic in conditionals. So next thing we need to look at is an else statement. So the else statement is like a um, natural continuation of the if statement. So obviously the condition isn't always met. So if the condition isn't met, we want something else. We might want something else to happen, right? So the else statement is like a continuation of the if statement. You can just add it on after. So you can just it's like an alternative action if the condition isn't met. So else you have to like start a new line for else and then use the colon again, and then the action underneath it is what happens if you reach that alternative if the original condition is met. So let's use the original example of happiness equals 125. So since it meets this first condition, right, then we should expect it to perform the first action. So yeah, it did. And one more thing to know about these condition if else's is that it stops after it performs its first action. So let's say it does the if statement, then it automatically won't do the else statement because it already achieved one of the actions. So only goes until it achieves one of the actions, like which is print happy or print unhappy. So it won't like do this condition and then go to the else and then do the same the action for else. So let's change it to 90, right? Which obviously does not meet this first condition. Then we should expect it to go to the else, the alternative, and print unhappy. So yeah, it printed unhappy. And then another continuation of the elif statement, the if statement is the elif statement or the else if statement. It's abbreviated as elif. So what this does is it essentially is kind of like the else, an alternative, except it allows you to provide a condition with the alternative. So the notation for that is elif and then condition and then colon. So it's basically like another if statement. Elif happiness less than 60, right? And you want to print very unhappy. And then you can also add an else statement at the end as well. So this else in this case, since there's multiple conditions, it's kind of like a default. So it's like if all the conditions aren't met, then you just do the else, right? Else, and then just say print. I'm just gonna print default, right? So now we have to look through two conditions. So if the first condition is met, then we just perform first action. First condition is not met, then we look at the second condition, and then say so on, right? Until if none of the conditions are met, it just does the else automatically. So right now we have let's meet the first condition. Then it should perform the first action, which is print happy. So it did meet the first condition, so which is meaning happiness greater than 100. So it printed happy. Now let's see what happens if it doesn't meet the first condition but meets the second condition. So let's say happy with 40. Then it should perform the second action, right? This is the alternative, which it did. And let's see what happens if it doesn't meet either. So if it's in between these values, then it's not happiness over 100 and it's not happiness less than 60. So it should do the default, which is the else, which it did. So another type of conditional is the while loop, and I talked about that in another video, the iterations video. So I'm not gonna go over that again. But however, it is a conditional because the loop occurs while a condition is met. So there are more complex versions of these conditionals, and I'll talk about those right now. So the next one I want to talk about is the nested if. So it's like kind of you have to meet two conditions to do an action, right? So it's like let's say happiness equals 80, right? If happiness less than 100, right? And then you have another if statement. So what we can see here that there's two if statements. So if the first statement is met, then we have to go through another if statement in order to print unhappy. And this is not too useful in this situation, but it can be useful in other situations where you can't write all the conditions in one line. So here, obviously, if we have to meet both of these conditions, then we can simply delete this line, and it would be the same thing, right? Because if it's under 100, if it's under 60, it must be under 100. Um, however, it still works in this case. So when we have happiness equals 80, right? We want to see if it meets this condition. So first, it does meet this condition. Then we move on to the next if, right? If this if condition is met, then we print unhappy. However, 80 is greater than 60, so this condition isn't met. The if happiness less than 60, so we don't perform any action. Oh, sorry, I typed it wrong here. So nothing happened, right? However, if we change this to 40, meaning it meets this condition, less than 100 and less than 60, then it should print unhappy, which it did. Finally, going back to this first box here, we can actually use ors and ands inside conditionals. So with this, I'll just use a new box actually. So let's say happiness equals 80, right? So we can use and. So if happiness greater than 60 and happiness less than 100, print perfect, something like that, right? So what this means is that both of these conditions have to be met in order to print this perfect. So that's what and does. So as we can see, 80 is greater than 60 and less than 100, so this action should occur. And it did. It printed perfect. However, let's say it only meets one condition. Let's say it's 900. So it does meet this first condition, right? Greater than 60, but it's not less than 100. So it should not occur since both of these conditions. So we should not do this action because both of the conditions have to be met in order for it to happen. So as we can see when we play it now, when we run it now, it doesn't. Nothing happens. Next, let's talk about or. So equals 100. So or is essentially the opposite. So it's only one of these statements. It's not the opposite, but it's only one of the statements need to be true. Say we have happiness equals 100 and happiness less than 200. So as we can see here, right? This should be or. As we can see here, this only meets one condition. Since happiness is equal to 100, it's not greater than 100. So this condition is not met. However, this condition is met because happiness is less than 200, meaning this should occur. Only one of the conditions has to be met. If both of them are met, then it also works. So it printed out works. And finally, you can actually combine ors and ands. So if you do something like, I'm not going to actually type out the entire example, but if you have right here, right, and another condition, right, happiness less than 300, and this should work as well, since what this essentially is asking you is if either this is true or this entire condition is true. So if it's less than both of these or it's greater than 100, then you do the action.